want to welcome back to the program Sara Pappantonio from the firm.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Let's talk about, you're working on a baby infant
Infant formula. So we've got manufacturers like Abbott, Abbott Laboratories, and Mead Johnson manufacturing preterm infant formula. So this is formula for babies 37 weeks or below. And what we're finding is that it's causing necrotizing enterocolitis in those preterm infants.
Okay, what is necrotizing
enterocolitis? So it is probably one of the most tragic diseases that you can see in an infant or child. Necrotizing enterocolitis is essentially when bacteria enters the intestines and the gut of the child and causes the intestines to break down. So that little baby's gut, small intestinal tract, starts to eat itself from the inside out, and the baby's system just totally shuts down.
Okay, so I mean, all right, let's back up a little bit. Like, obviously, these are premature babies. They're not going to have the ability to latch on or breastfeed, so they need to be fed some type of formula. Have they always been fed this formula? I mean, what has been the standard of care, and did something change, or just an awareness that the outcomes were in part a function of the formula?
Right. So let me take you through the history of this. Infant formula has been around for a very long time. Of course, there's been advances in infant formula. The gold standard of infant feeding is always going to be breast milk. We know this. The manufacturers of infant formula know this. But what we've seen is as these corporations get bigger and bigger and the market for formula gets bigger and bigger, we see a shift. Right? Less women are breastfeeding and more women are using formula. The reason for that is, of course, motivated by profits, right? But I believe it's being sourced from the formula companies to decrease the risk of breast milk, ultimately to increase their profit margin, right? So as time has gone by, formula has always been available to children since the 1960s. But now we're seeing more advancements. Now we're seeing people starting to target NICUs. That's where these infants are being fed, in the intensive care unit, right?
Intensive care unit of neonatal, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know. I can say neonatal. Okay.
But what were they fed before then?
But I mean, it's primarily a breast milk heavy diet, and so here's the problem.
So the women would pump. Is that
right?
It?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so the problem with formula, and then we're not saying formula in general for infants is bad. We're saying formula for preterm infants is bad. Specifically, the cow's milk formula, right? Because preterm infants' guts cannot properly digest that cow's milk formula. And the unique aspect of this case is that science has been around for a long time. These formula manufacturers have known about the science, the increased risk associated with necrotizing enterocolitis and cow's milk formula for a long time, but they still continue to manufacture it. Why? Because the breast milk feeding rates have gone down and the formula feeding rates have gone up. And what we have found is that these companies create brand loyalty in the NICUs with mothers. They finally find a solution for feeding these little itty babies. The babies grow on that. They develop, and they become loyal to that brand of formula, Abbott's brand, Mead's brand. And so it creates a brand loyalty for the next 3 years of that infant's life. And you just see, I compare it to big tobacco, to the opioid litigation. You have detailers, salespeople going into hospitals, getting hospitals, babies, mothers hooked on that type of formula so that ultimately they can create a customer for years to come.
Right. I mean, that's the dynamic. That's the dynamic with all products, it feels like, and even frankly, with political parties. I mean, if you start
Right.
young on one, more often than not, you're going to carry through that. The problem is, for these, did they have any reason to know? What do you need to prove in this instance? Like, you have damages. Like, I mean, it's clear that from the science, I guess, I mean, you tell me, that these formulas are having bad outcomes with the children.
Mm-hmm.
What else do you need to prove for liability in this instance?
So when we walk into a case like this, the questions we ask ourselves and the questions that we ultimately have to show answer to a jury are, what did this company know? What should they have known? And what did they do about it once they figured out that there was a problem associated with their product? In addition to those three questions, we have to also answer, well, is there what we call a safer alternative design out there? Is there something else that these babies could have been ingesting, feeding on, that would have been safer for them? And the truth is that there is. Since 2006, we've had a product called Prolacta. Prolacta is a type of infant formula that is derived from human milk base. So rather than the cow's milk, you have actual breast milk that is being formulated in that product and sold to the NICU. So that's our safer alternative design. That's when the defendants say, well, we had no choice. These babies have to be fed. We say, no, well, they could have been fed a safer product, and you just chose not to invest in that, to manufacture that, right? Because what we think we'll see is that in the end, a cow's milk-based formula is going to be cheaper for these companies to manufacture. Tale as old as time.
It's almost
right.
Obvious that it would be.
And we see that. And I think that will really come out as this litigation goes forward, is it is a cost-benefit analysis every single time. Different case, same cost-benefit analysis. And that's what we see here.
Do they have to know that there was damage being done, or in how early in that process?
So these companies have to be put on notice of the issue, right? They have to be aware that their product is related to an increased risk of, in this case, necrotizing enterocolitis. And typically the way companies become aware of things like that is through clinical trials and independent studies and what we call cohort meta-analysis. And so as far back as the 1990s, you have studies coming out that say cow's milk is associated with an increased risk of necrotizing enterocolitis in preterm infants. Every single time a study is published like that should be a huge glaring red flag to the manufacturer. But instead, what we see them do, and what they publicly do, is they take that study, they rip it apart, they say, you can't trust this study for these reasons, and they ignore it. And they do that study after study after study. And then what you see them do is do their own internal clinical studies with the same flaws and use that as grounds to support that their product is safe.
And because what they're doing in terms of their strategy is they are playing this out as long as they can, because every day means X amount of profits. And so even if they know that at one point the music's going to end and we're going to have to, in this game musical chairs, we're going to sit and we'll be left out, that cost associated is going to be a fraction of what they've been able to make by essentially punting every time a study comes out. There's problems with this study. This is why we punt. I mean, in their mind, they're thinking like the outcome's either going to be we're able to ignore these studies in perpetuity, or we're not able to ignore these studies in perpetuity, but long enough that there's no payouts that are going to in any way make it not worth it for us to keep paying. I mean, that is the 85% of every interview I've had here is basically that's what we're hearing.
And what they really do, frankly, the defendants do a good job of here is, if you create just enough doubt in the scientific community, you can do just that. You can punt. And so if you create that doubt with industry-funded science to challenge the independent science just a little bit, it allows them to keep manufacturing for a year, to continue on just enough until the crap really hits the fan, honestly, for lack of a better word.
And so where are you now in the process?
So we are in the height of discovery. And what that means is that we are in the defendant's file cabinets. We're reading what they knew, what they could have known, what they should have known, the internal studies that they were doing at the time all of this had come about. And that's how we really start to list out what we call the liability story, which will ultimately be shown to a jury, hopefully next year, or at the very least by the end of next year. And so what we are doing is we're putting together our themes and theories of the case. We are talking with mothers, hospitals, doctors, and really coming up with a solid just narrative and story for how these companies are taking advantage of mothers and children. And the unique part about this case that you don't see in big tobacco, that you don't see in opioids and some of these other pharma cases, is we're in a tough place because these formula companies hide behind this persona that they're saving babies' lives, that they're the reason that mothers can go to work and that babies can grow and premature babies are surviving for much longer. And there is some validity to that.
Right. I mean, if their product was not causing these problems, it would be serving that function. I mean,
Right.
A lot of women can't breastfeed and or, you know, frankly, it's very difficult. I've been through it twice. I mean, I obviously don't breastfeed.
So, I mean, we certainly will have an uphill battle from the public image perspective that you don't have with other litigations, because they truly are feeding our most vulnerable population. But the point is, the second you know that your product has an increased risk that could harm even 5 babies, at that point is when you should start making a safer product, and they just have not done that.
In the discovery, I've always been curious about this. Like, they're supposed to hand over every email, every document that they have produced around this. How do you know that they've given you every email or every document?
I think the way someone described it to me once is, for every every damning document you get from the defense, you can assume that there's one 10 times worse hidden somewhere else. There's no way to ever know that what you have is complete. But in the discovery process right now, my role is organizing all of the depositions, making sure we have the documents that we need. And time after time, when we get into these depositions, they will drop another 10,000 documents on us within a week's time of the deposition. And every time they tell us they're done, they drop 20,000 more documents. It's just a tactic that they use.
That I get. The idea of, like, we're going to dump our documents on you in an amount and in a fashion that will overwhelm your resources to sort of intake them and digest them. But, like, do you go through documents and then you find, like, hey, wait a second, here's a letter, here's an email from Bob to Mary, but where's the one, Bob's responding to something Mary said, but where's Mary's email to Bob?
Constantly.
And that's where you start to be aware that their documents we're not getting.
Yeah.
And so then you have to file with them to be like, we need Mary's end of this.
Oh, it is a constant game of back and forth. And let me tell you,
and then what if you get to the point where they're like, oh, we can't find it, or no, that's it. Bob just must have had a conversation with Mary at the water cooler about something. Like, how do you resolve? You go back into the judge and say, here's the situation. Like,
it's tough sometimes. Sometimes the judge can see right through it. Sometimes you have to take it to the actual witness who is writing the document and just beat them the heck up until they tell you the truth. And once you have affirmative statements from the witness saying, yeah, oh, I actually responded to that email and this is what I said, then you go back to the judge and say, look, they haven't produced everything to us. But let me tell you, these defendants have gotten so smart. And through tobacco, they learn lessons. Through opioid, they learn lessons. And what we're finding is that big corporations are having shorter time frames in which they preserve emails. Right? Some of the most damning documents we saw in the early mass torts are emails, because no one thought that attorneys would have the ability to go in and scour that. So now we have companies that have 6-month retention policies, 1-year retention policies, and we're talking about a case that goes all the way back to 2006. So there's a lot we don't know and that we'll never know, right? Because these companies are playing the game smarter.
Is there no opportunity for, like, some type of statutory fix for that? I mean, it seems to me like, look, as a private individual, I have to retain my, taxes for 7 years, I think it is, right? And why not as a function of you being issued a corporate charter in this state, or even to operate across state lines from a federal perspective, the regulation is you've got to keep your documents for 15 years or something.
Yeah, well, I think that is an awesome thought in theory, Sam, but I think you know how politics works, and that all of these corporations have every senator, every legislator in their pocket. And at the second that bill was even suggested, it would get put down immediately, because there no Johnson & Johnson, no Pfizer, no Abbott labs would ever allow something like that, because they have seen the effect it has had in previous litigations, right? And so I don't know that we'll ever see that because of the way corporations control politics.
Interesting. Well, it's a fascinating case. And so if there are, in how does this, the form of colitis, I can't say the word, how does that present itself later? Like, at what point does it present? Is it something that develops in that moment, or is it something as the child grows, it becomes problematic?
So what happens is when the child ingests the cow's milk formula, the body does not know how to react to the cow's milk enzyme, so it attacks it. It attacks its own self. If the child is lucky enough to survive, then they have a host of issues for the rest of their life. What we're seeing a lot of is something called short gut syndrome. That is where they remove a large portion of your bowels and intestines, and for the rest of your life, you either have to have a colostrum bag, or you have significant problems digesting and taking down foods. Other times we see a significant lack of oxygen to the brain because your gut's not working in the right ways, and children are diagnosed with cerebral palsy. So a lot of deaths, but sometimes the alternative of living with all of these complications, these children have terrible, terrible lives ahead of them. And they just never had the chance, all because these doctors were not warned against that chance that their child would get neck.
How many cases are we talking about? Do you know?
So there's currently two tracks of lawsuits going on. We have the federal track, which is what I'm working with, and there's state law litigation. And I would say between both of those cases, we're seeing probably about 1,000 to 2,000 cases on file. Oh. And the interesting part is that based on the math that we've done, there's about 2,500 cases of NEC per year. And this goes back to 2006. We are not seeing as many mothers and fathers and families come forward. And I think it is largely due to the fact that mothers ultimately feel ashamed that this happened to their child. And it typically happens in settings where the mother cannot produce enough breast milk. So there's this guilt and the shame on the mother that says, well, if I had just produced breast milk, or if I had just done this, my child would have been alive. But what they don't know is that the whole time that their child was given this formula, that there was a safer alternative out there. And they don't know that because they were never warned against. The hospitals were never told this. And so there's this gut-wrenching shame that they have, which we need to do as attorneys a better job of telling mothers that, no, this is not your fault. You didn't know these things. You couldn't have known these things because the companies withheld that. And so I say all that to say is there's a lot of cases out there, but there is a lot of families that are scared to pursue it because it just opens up the horrible trauma that they went through, and then the shame and guilt that they might feel, when in reality they should never feel that way.
And I would imagine also there's a certain percentage of families that are just simply unaware of it. I mean, no one at the hospital is going to say it's a function of the formula that we decided to use.
Right.
And certainly the manufacturers. And so there's really no way for them necessarily to know
exactly
that could have been that was a function of that formula.
And that's why it's so important to have you at conferences like this and have you be able to tell our story, because a lot of times when we try to communicate these issues to the media, again, it goes back to corporate media. The corporations have control of the media. We're not able to get that message out to tell mothers and tell them in a way that does not make them feel guilty or does not kind of cause them to relive that trauma. There's just so many ways we can help families and so many ways we can make products safer, but it is hard at times to get that message out to the media.
Have they made any change in their product? Or are they still continuing to sell the same product?
So what you'll see is that over time, they make adjustments to their product. And every time what their narrative is that we are trying to make our product closer to breast milk. And it is almost in a sense that they're trying to make it equivalent to breast milk. It'll never be equivalent to breast milk. But if they had made the decision in 2006 when this idea of the human milk formula and fortifier actually became available, then that would have been now 15 years of safer formula feeding for preterm infants. And I think eventually that they will be forced into that change because we are finally getting this message out. But until now, we haven't seen it.
Well, that's one of the two big sort of, I think, positives that come out of these type of cases is, one, addressing the needs of those people who've been victimized by these products, and then essentially like making sure there's less victims down the road by convincing, these companies to sort of operate in a different way. Sara Pappantonio, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.